Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Clement Biddle, the Foragemaster General of the Continental Army. Before we get started, I want to give a big shout out to Jan Hicks, who has not only made several generous contributions to Founder of the Day, but helped provide some of the research for this very video. So thank you, Jan. You keep writing about the Biddles, keep sending me information, I'll keep putting out content. So, the Biddle family at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War was one of the most successful merchant families of Philadelphia, itself a merchant city. Many of the Biddles serve in various capacities throughout the American founding, but as for Clement Biddle, he joins the Continental Army pretty much right off the bat and is quickly commissioned as a colonel, though he doesn't lead a lot of men. Instead, he pretty much takes up the position of Deputy Quartermaster General right away, and he would serve in this position in various aspects throughout the entirety of the war. He first becomes fairly well known after the battles of Trenton and Princeton, when the Americans capture all these Hessian soldiers, these German soldiers. Clement is put in charge of moving these captured men out to Pennsylvania, where it's kind of heavily German already. So that way the German citizens could say, hey, isn't it great here? And maybe we can convince some of these Germans to stay around and become Americans. Either way, Clement doesn't actually oversee this in particular. He does not travel on the journey, but he is in charge with delegating the responsibility to many men who successfully carry out this difficult task. Now, the following year, the Continental Army goes into winter quarters at Valley Forge. And Valley Forge is kind of famous for not being super great if you are a common soldier. There wasn't a lot of food to eat, not a lot of clothes to wear. It's about this time that Clement Biddle, to be fair, it was about 6 months before the previous summer, when Clement Biddle was promoted to Commissary General of Forage, better known as Foragemaster General. And I did see him called both of these throughout my research, although usually it's Commissary General of Forage, but Foragemaster General, it's just such a cool name. So Foragemaster over here, he is tasked with the impossible job of feeding the Continental Army, specifically on forage. Now, forage is basically what it sounds like. Generally, it's you're not necessarily foraging through the woods, but you are collecting certain types of food for soldiers to eat. Specifically, usually, it's types of grains and other items of that nature. So, Biddle, at this point, doesn't have good supply lines. The river is frozen over, the roads are impossible to traverse, but Biddle takes a bunch of wagons out to New Jersey because at this same time, there are a bunch of skirmishes and battles that are breaking out throughout the winter of early 1778 in New Jersey. And this is known as the Forage Wars because they were fighting over food from local farms. Fortunately for those farmers, they didn't have much of a say in the matter. They were just, someone was going to take their food. And as Foragemaster, it was Biddle's job to retrieve these stores that were taken in New Jersey and transport them back to the Continental Army. Again, an extremely difficult job, but he is given a lot of money and wagons by George Washington himself. And Biddle corresponds extraordinary amount with George Washington throughout the remainder of his life, but we will get to that. Biddle ends up going out, doing his best to get the food. He does get most of the food that the Continental Army did actually eat. He's the one who retrieves and brings to them. So while it's easy to look at Biddle and say, hey, you didn't get anyone any food, you could look the other way and say, hey, you're the only one who got anyone food, which is essentially what he did. Again, a very impossible task he was given, and he actually does it fairly well. During this time, he writes to General Washington and says, hey, Washington, we need food sent in. We can't just get it all from New Jersey. Because I should note that at the time, George Washington didn't like the idea of just stealing food from farmers. These were Americans. He was fighting for them, in his opinion. So when it was necessary to take food from small farmers, he would generally either pay them or give them an IOU, which didn't necessarily always work out. And he would do his best to leave the farmers enough food to at least pay their taxes and survive the following year. They might not have enough to make a profit this year, but they could survive and continue on their farm in the future. Biddle, I wouldn't say he oversteps some of these bounds. He gains permission from Washington to be a little more lenient with some of these rules because, it was Valley Forge. And additionally, it's his writing to Washington and another gentleman he was working with were writing to Washington saying, we need the states to donate some food. Like Jersey's doing what it can. We're stealing it from Jersey. We need Jersey to send some more. It was New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia and Maryland. very specifically Virginia and Maryland. He was saying, like, they need to send us food or we're going to starve to death. And Washington does end up making a plea, essentially on Biddle's behalf, of just this nature. Now, there's not a whole lot of help that arrives, but a little help does come. And it is important to note that Clement Biddle was that important to the Continental Army and to George Washington to have his opinion taken so seriously. Not a lot of people would simply tell Washington what to do, and while Biddle was very polite and humble in his request, it wasn't so much of a request, it was a demand. It was, we need this to happen. As I said, that's really the peak of Biddle's career. He does continue in this position throughout the Revolutionary War, still feeding soldiers. After the war ends, Clement Biddle goes back to his job as a rich person in Philadelphia, a merchant. I did see he was listed in a census as a notary, scriber, and bookkeeper. So he had a few other tasks in there, but essentially being a wealthy merchant was his job. I should also note that George Washington goes back home, and while Washington is back home, you don't necessarily get everything in and around Mount Vernon you might want if you're a wealthy plantation owner, and Philadelphia was the biggest city around with all the most fun stuff coming in. So Washington, as many rich people had in different cities around America and around the world, they would have agents who made purchases for them, took a little cut off the top and sent it back to them. And George Washington's agent in the wealthiest city of Philadelphia was Clement Biddle. And Clement Biddle spends the remainder of George Washington's life as his agent, buying him things and sending there, taking a little slice off the top, as merchant would want to do. And it actually ends up that the Biddle-Washington papers are quite extensive, and most of it is Clement Biddle and George Washington through the Revolutionary War and through the first presidency. I also want to note, when George Washington does finally become the first president in 1789, he needs to appoint people to all sorts of positions. And one of these positions is U.S. Marshal, specifically U.S. Marshal for Pennsylvania. And the first person to ever hold that title, U.S. Marshal for the District of Pennsylvania, was Clement Biddle, who essentially oversaw all the enforcement of laws, federal laws, in the state of Pennsylvania for the first 4 years of the country's existence, until, that is, Biddle goes back to his nice, comfortable life as a rich person in Philadelphia. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a little bit about Clement Biddle. I have a bunch of other videos about the Biddle family, which I'll try to link below if I remember. I really appreciate your support and appreciate you watching. I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.